So today we're going to be talking a little bit more about this parable, but since this is the start of a series on parables, we're going to talk a little bit in general about why the Lord spoke using parables. It seems that very often when Jesus spoke to people, he was using parables. And it's even said that he did not speak to the people except in parables. The Lord's explanation in the gospel of why he would do this is that so people could hear and yet not hear. Parables present a truth hidden in a story. And it is fair to say hidden because even when there may be an obvious lesson, there are still more truths hidden under the surface. And this is actually true of every part of the Word. And so even in places where it may not seem that Jesus is using a parable, he is still speaking in language of parables. There is a lesson or deeper truths hidden within. And this nature of the Word and of parables, it serves two purposes. First, when the Lord speaks to us in the Word, it allows people who are ready and willing to follow him to see deeper truths. But it prevents people who are not willing or not ready to see them. And second, it means that the Lord can gradually lead us from a simple, external, surface level understanding into deeper and higher truths. Gradually as we're ready to see them. So the parable we're going to look at today has a relatively obvious story about the church. If we look at the history of the children of Israel, we can see that they repeatedly turned aside from the Lord's simple covenant, which was that if they followed his commandments, they would be blessed with safety and prosperity. And instead, they often chose their own selfish pursuits. As he said to them, "I set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life." And yet they chose death. And in some cases, literally, they chose to die instead of follow the Lord's commandments. And like in this parable as well, when the servants were sent to the guests, when they abused them, they killed them. When the Lord sent his prophets to teach the church, they were often abused and sometimes even killed for inviting people back to the Lord's way. Now, in the parable, when it talks about the people, those people who were first invited as representing those within the church, this is not actually suggesting that the Lord has a preference for any special class of people, only that the church has the priority of information. They know what the Lord has taught them. The church, because it has the Word, has access to more clear teaching about the Lord and about what he expects from us. And so this makes their refusal or choice not to respond even more surprising and condemning. As shocking as the idea of refusing an invitation from a king simply to come to a wedding, if we compare that to the idea of refusing to come to heaven when the Lord is inviting us, that seems absolutely crazy. And then add to that idea that they would kill the messengers bringing the invitation. It just seems unbelievable. But if we unravel this parable, we'll see that this is something that all of us are tempted and may even do. But before we get into that, we're going to read an explanation about this specific parable from the teachings of the new church. Our second lesson is from Apocalypse or Revelation Explained. It says, "A supper means heaven and the church. Those who are called and yet excuse themselves mean the Jewish nation, with whom the church was then. For the church is specifically where the Word is and where the Lord is known through the Word. Then the poor, the maimed, the halt, and the blind, It means those who are spiritually such and who are then outside the church. Heaven and the church are both likened to a supper and to a wedding, because heaven is a conjunction of angels with the Lord by love, and their consociation among themselves by charity, and the consequent communication of all delight and felicity. And the same is true of the church, because the church is the Lord's heaven on earth. And so we see the condemnation of the church is for refusing to be called, and it is just as relevant today. Christians who have the Word may choose to lead lives contrary to the Lord's commandments. And they may also resent being called to return to following the Lord. And killing the Lord's servants is what we do if we take the truths that the Lord has given to us, and we twist or corrupt them to justify the evils which we have chosen to live. The punishment or the hell that is given to those which may seem to come from the king or from our Lord is really the result of us choosing death and cursing over life and blessing. So when those first guests reject the Lord, then he invites the bad and good, the poor, the maimed, the halt, and the blind. On one deeper level, this means people who are outside the church who don't have the same access to the truth. And they have been hurt, or they are sick because they're ignorant of the real truths. They have made mistakes, and they are hurting. So this applies to people who are outside the church, but it also applies to us as well. People inside the church who have fallen into some evil or falsity and yet still want to follow the Lord. Now, if you're familiar with this parable, you might know that there's a somewhat strange ending to it. We're going to read again. It says, "The king, coming in to observe the guests, saw there was a man who had not put on a wedding garment. So he says to him, 'Fellow, how came thou in hither without having a wedding garment?' And he was silent. And the king said to the ministers, having bound him in feet and hands, 'Take him up and cast him out into the outer darkness, where there are weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" So on the surface, this seems strange. Why would the king expect the poor and the crippled people to come wearing proper wedding garments? The deeper truth about this is that it's telling us about people who are hypocrites. They pretend to be part of the church. They put on a show of being holy and righteous, and yet they are not following the Lord in their heart. So in the language of the parable, this is saying he had a wedding garment, but he chose not to wear it. He chose not to respect the Lord's invitation. Now, of course, the Lord is infinitely forgiving. He wants everyone to come to heaven, as this parable is showing us. But it's not enough just to be invited. Our response matters. Are we going to respond? Will we choose to respond to the invitation sincerely, not hypocritically or selfishly? Because remember, serving their own interests is what made the first group of people refuse to go to the wedding. And if we are caught up in our own ideas, our own ambitions, when we hear the Lord's invitation, we will not accept. So how will we choose to respond to the Lord? Will we accept his invitation to the wedding feast? Heaven is called a wedding feast because a man can be a picture of a truth, and a woman can be a picture of love. And when love and truth are united in our minds, there is a spiritual marriage. And yet also, unfortunately, if truth is divided from good, it's like divorce or adultery. When Israel disobeyed the Lord's commandments, he compared their behavior to an unfaithful wife. He said, "Bring charges against your mother, bring charges, for she is not my wife, nor am I her husband. Let her put away her harlotries from her sight, and her adulteries from between her breasts. Also, within ourselves, if we know what the Lord commands us and expects of us, but we choose to do something different, we are divorcing truth and love in our own minds. We are breaking that spiritual marriage. Now, the state of the world today is similar to when Hosea was speaking to the church. Many people within the church do not live as they know they should. And this is also the case with people outside the church. They may know less of the truth, but they also frequently don't live up to the best that they know how. Now, depending on your perspective, you could see things getting better or worse in the world around us. But a good indication for the overall spiritual state of the world is the state of marriages. As the parable implies, there's a deep connection between the spiritual marriage that makes heaven and the church within us, and also marriage. Do loving and respectful and happy marriages seem to be the rule or the exception in the world today? Unfortunately, it seems like they may be more the exception than the rule. And yet, the key to solving both the larger problems in the world as well as the specific decline of marriage is to work on having this spiritual marriage in our hearts and minds. Marriages take work, and so too the spiritual marriage will take work. It's not simply enough to accept the invitation. We have to come. We have to make ourselves ready, put on a wedding garment, which means taking on the Lord's truth and uniting it to good in our lives, and not just externally, but also in our hearts. But the Lord will help us. He's on our side. He's inviting all of us, with our faults, with our failures. He's inviting us all to the wedding feast. He wants everyone to come. If we accept the Lord's call and the internal marriage in our spirits, we can also hope to see an end to the sad destruction of unhealthy relationships, and then a revival of marriage like it was from the beginning, male and female, in perfect harmony and perfect balance. We'll close with a reading from the prophet Jeremiah, speaking of a time when the church will be restored along with marriage. And I will cause the captivity of Judah and the captivity of Israel to return, and I will build them as at the first. I will cleanse them from all their iniquity, whereby they have sinned against me, and I will pardon all their iniquities, whereby they have sinned and whereby they have transgressed against me. Thus says Yahweh, yet again there shall be heard in this place, which you say is a waste, without man and without beast, even in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem that are desolate, without man and without those who dwell in her, and without beast, the voice of joy and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, and the voice of those who shall say, Confess Yahweh of armies, for Yahweh is good, for his mercy is to eternity. Thus says Yahweh of armies, Still in this place, which is a waste without man and without beast, and in all its cities, it shall be a home for shepherds causing their flocks to lie down. Amen.